I was halfway through the long-term parking lot when I stopped cold. The sky was clear, and the wind had that sharp winter edge, but what hit me wasn't the cold. I had forgotten something, not my ticket, not my phone, something deeper. I had left the original will in the house, Arthur's will, the one with his notes in the margins, the real one, not the copy tucked in my desk drawer. I turned around, thinking I'd be quick 5 minutes in and out. I didn't plan to step into the kind of moment that breaks something clean inside you. The kind of moment you never come back from the same. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever realized someone you love has quietly made you the problem. My name is Dolores Whitaker, and I'm 74 years old. I spent most of my life inside quiet rooms lined with shelves, old paper ink wood floors, and the soft clatter of people looking for something they'd lost or didn't know they needed. I worked in archival collections at the university for 35 years, and I was good at it. I was also a wife to Arthur, who loved diagrams more than small talk, and a mother to Grant, who used to build bridges out of popsicle sticks and ask questions about everything. He was bright, stubborn, careful, and I loved him more than anything. After Arthur passed 3 years ago, the house didn't feel too empty. Not right away. It felt paused, like he'd be back to finish a thought. He'd started Grant, had helped with the funeral arrangements, and sorted through the insurance papers he took over the bills. Even replaced the accountant without asking. I thought he was trying to take care of me. I didn't question it much at the time. We don't question help when it comes softly. We nod. We thank them. We adjust the mourning. I turned the car around. I wasn't thinking about any of that. I just wanted to grab the folder from the filing cabinet and get back to the airport before traffic picked up. I let myself in without calling out. The house was still in that heavy way that makes your chest tighten. I stepped lightly down the hall and heard voices, low, deliberate, careful. I paused by the archway just out of sight. The first voice was Grant's, and the second one belonged to a man I only knew by name. Ashby, the lawyer he brought around after Arthur died. They were talking about me, not with concern, not with care, but in the language of strategy, diminished capacity, memory lapses, medical guardianship. Grant said he had already started gathering examples. He spoke like a man preparing a case, bullet points and all. I stood there with my back against the wall, hearing my own son explain how to turn me into paperwork. I don't know how long I stood in the hallway, but when I backed away, my hands were steady. I walked out to the car, sat in the driver's seat, and stared straight ahead. I had worked night shifts for years so Grant could finish school without debt. I packed his lunches, folded his laundry, read every note his teacher sent home, and now he was compiling evidence against me. But the worst part wasn't what he said. It was how unsurprised I was. I had seen the signs. I just didn't want to believe them. The auto payments, the quiet changes, the careful redirections. This wasn't new. It had just become impossible to ignore. I didn't go back to the airport. I didn't call my sister. I drove through streets I hadn't seen in decades until I found myself parked in front of an old bakery. Arthur and I used to visit when Grant was still in grade school. The smell of cinnamon and butter drifted through the air, just like it always had. The tables were new, but the feeling wasn't. I sat by the window with a coffee that I barely tasted, and remembered how Grant used to build towers out of sugar packets, how Arthur read the paper, and how I used to feel like we were all exactly where we belonged. Now, the pieces didn't fit, and I wasn't sure they ever had. By the time I left the bakery, the sun had dipped low, and I wasn't ready to go home. Instead, I drove to the university library, parked in the back where I always used to, and walked straight to the archives. I asked to see a document, a copy of Arthur's will, the original, one cataloged years ago under my own initials. And there it was, with all his notes still intact, and one small yellow sticky note in the back corner written in Arthur's unmistakable hand. "If you ever feel unsure," it said, "the answer is always in the numbers." The smell of cinnamon still clung to my coat as I stepped out of the bakery into the gray light. The clouds had thickened above the rooftops, the kind of sky that made the day feel heavier than it should. My hands stayed wrapped around the coffee cup. Even after I tossed it, the warmth was gone, but I needed something to hold on to. I drove aimlessly for a while, past intersections I hadn't seen in years, until the streets started to feel familiar again. Not because I lived there, but because they belonged to a version of me that remembered who I was. The library parking lot was nearly empty when I pulled in. I chose the same spot I used to when I worked there, just under the shadow of the big oak tree. The branches were bare, now gently swaying in the cold wind. I sat in the car for a moment before heading inside. The interior had changed, new carpet, new lights, but the quiet was the same. I walked past the front desk and into the archives room without hesitation. My feet remembered the way, even if I hadn't stepped foot in there in years. A young woman looked up from behind the counter. I asked if I could see a document I'd cataloged years ago. She nodded, handed me a clipboard, and motioned to the back corner. The file was exactly where it should have been. Thick from Arthur's notes, not the will itself. He had always been meticulous. His handwriting crowded the margins like footnotes to a conversation only he and I could understand. And tucked near the back, on a yellow sticky note, were the words, "If you ever feel unsure, the answer is always in the numbers." I turned to the last page, and there they were. Rows of figures, properties, investments, bonds. And next to each one, a notation. D, to retain D, or grant, if qualified legal hold, until independent review. He hadn't left me out. He had trusted me, and in that moment, I felt something unlock, not in anger, but in clarity. I reached into my bag, pulled out a small notepad, and began writing Copy's legal counsel audit. Legal counsel, every word deliberate, underlined, not to remember, but to make real. The sun had disappeared behind the rooftops by the time I stepped back outside. The air had grown colder, but I didn't pull my coat tighter. I felt steady, not watched, not small, not like someone waiting to be told what to do. My breath curled in front of me as I walked back to the car, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like someone else's burden. I felt like Dolores again. The next morning, I moved slower, not because of age, but because it helped the illusion feel real. I retrieved the voice recorder from the back of the drawer, the same one I used to carry for oral history interviews at the library. It was small, no bigger than a thumb press, once for record press, again to save. I slipped it into the lining of my coat where the red light blinked once, then vanished. I left the front door unlocked, not wide open, just enough to say I had forgotten the kettle, whistled soft steam curling above it. I poured the tea and let a few drops spill onto the counter. I left the pill bottles near the sink, the crossword puzzle on the table half finished, the pen missing its cap. All of it meant to look like the quiet forgetfulness of someone slipping away. By 10:30, Grant let himself in. His footsteps paused just inside the door, then moved toward the kitchen. I stayed seated at the table, still in my robe. I looked up when he kissed my cheek and said, "It felt cold in the house." He unpacked the grocery bag slowly. Soup, a loaf of bread, a tin of crackers. Every movement careful, like someone playing a part. He asked how I was sleeping. I answered vaguely, then changed the subject, let my fingers fumble with the spoon. He offered to warm the soup, and I nodded as though I needed the help. While he stirred the pot, he scanned the room, eyes resting on the mail, the calendar, the pill bottles. He commented on an insurance letter, still unopened, and offered to look through it. I pretended not to hear. After we ate, he leaned against the doorframe and looked at me for a long time. Then he said, he had been researching care homes, just looking into options. He said, with gardens and music therapy, places with staff trained in memory care. He said it gently, as if it were kindness. I blinked, then said, it might be nice to have someone else cook. I waited a beat, then asked him what day it was. He smiled softly like he'd gotten the answer he needed. He stayed another 20 minutes, tidying up, asking if I needed anything, checking the locks on the back door. I stayed at the table, quiet, nodding when needed. The recorder inside my coat still capturing every word, every pause. When he finally left, I walked to the study, peeled off my coat, and placed the recorder on the desk. My hands didn't shake. I pressed stop. Then sat down in the silence, not to mourn what I had heard, but to remember it exactly later that afternoon. I found the old Rolodex buried behind the cookbooks. It hadn't been touched in years, but the card was still there. Mal Leland Brooks, legal. Researcher, former colleague. We hadn't spoken in a long while, not from any falling out, just life folding in on itself after Arthur passed. I called and left a message. My voice was even calm. I told her I needed someone I could trust, that it was personal. She replied. An hour later, said she'd be at my house by 4 when she arrived. She stepped in, like no time had passed. Navy wool coat, hair pulled back. No pleasantries, no explanations. She took the seat across from me. I poured chamomile into mismatched cups, then slid the recorder across the table, along with the will. No preamble. Just the facts. She listened straight through, eyes steady, face unreadable. When the recording ended, she looked at me and said, "We're going to fix this." Then, she opened her laptop and began typing. We spent the next hour going over every step she asked about the power of attorney. When it had last been updated, I told her it hadn't since Arthur died. She said that would be the first thing to change. She outlined a plan, quiet, legal thorough. She asked about backups cloud storage. I said no. She said we'd fix that too. We moved to the den where she scanned the annotated will, helped me set up an encrypted drive, and showed me how to create private folders before she left. She placed a single sheet in front of me. It was the formal revocation of Grant's authority, dated, signed, notarized. I added my name to it and watched her slip it into her briefcase. Her final words were simple. This is the first step after she left. I sat by the window and watched the branches sway just slightly in the wind. The silence in the house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt measured, like something solid was being built again. One document at a time, one step, one version of myself. The next few mornings followed a rhythm. Marilyn had given me a checklist, but I no longer needed it, printed by day. 2. I started with my medical records. I scheduled an appointment with Dr. Elkins, the same doctor I had seen for over a decade. I requested a cognitive evaluation, not for myself, but for the file. He didn't question it, ran the tests, reviewed my history, and handed me a signed letter. No impairment documented, cognitively sound. I folded it carefully and placed it in a new file folder at home. I began pulling together anything that could confirm my mental clarity. Bank statements, handwritten notes, grocery receipts, printed emails from the past 2 years. I made lists. I dated every page. I organized them into folders marked legal, medical, personal, then scanned each one into the cloud storage. Marilyn helped me set up at the back of my closet behind winter coats and an unused suitcase. I found a box labeled Arthur Mace. It held letters. Most short notes from our early years, grocery reminders, little hearts drawn beside his name, but tucked between 2 brochures was a single page. No envelope, folded and slightly yellowed. Dated 10 years ago. It read, "If the day comes when our son makes you doubt yourself, trust your instinct. You've always seen clearer than you believe." I sat on the edge of the bed, letter in hand, and listened to the wind press gently against the windows. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just held the words that had waited a decade for the moment they'd be needed. And now they had arrived 3 days after finding Arthur's note. I backed up every file again and placed the flash drive in the small safety deposit box I kept at the credit union tucked beside my passport and a deed copy. I added a final note to my journal and then went to bed without turning on the hallway light. For the first time in weeks, I didn't wake up to check the locks. I had done the work, and that let me rest. It was midweek when Grant showed up again. No warning, no call. Just the doorbell and the rustle of a paper bag. When I opened the door, he stood there with a small bouquet of tulips and a familiar smile. The kind he used as a boy when he was hoping to soften a no. I let him in. Without a word, he handed me the flowers, and I placed them in the green vase near the dining room window. He moved into the kitchen on instinct, unpacking soup. A crusty roll, a chocolate bar from the grocery sack. We sat at the table while he warmed lunch. He asked again how I'd been sleeping. I told him. Some nights were better than others. He nodded and said, maybe it was time to consider bringing in help, someone to check in. Now and then, I didn't argue. I let the suggestions sit between us while I stirred the soup slowly with my spoon. He watched me, not unkindly, but closely. Like someone studying a puzzle they've already decided how to solve. He brought up the names of a few places he'd researched, assisted living communities nearby with gardens and programs and trained staff. He said, I deserved rest, that it wasn't safe to be alone too long. I ran my fingers along the edge of the napkin and said, I'd consider it when he asked if I'd like him to drive me to tour one of them next week. I said, perhaps. Then I looked down at the table and asked what day it was, again just as I had last time. He answered and smiled gently, like it confirmed something. He stayed longer. This time, moved through the hallway, checked the lights, mentioned the loose porch railing, and a flickering bulb in the laundry room. He touched my shoulder before leaving, said he just wanted what was best. I placed my hand on his and told him I knew the moment the door clicked shut behind him. I walked into the study and retrieved the recorder from under the napkin holder. It had been running the entire visit, every sentence, every careful phrase I saved, the file under a new label, Visit Grant Assisted Living Discussion, and uploaded it that evening. The next morning, I moved the side table in the living room just a few inches enough to make space for a second recording device. I checked the angle and range and tested the microphone placement. It would catch conversations on the porch too. If they happened near the window, I left the front door unlocked again and placed a measuring cup in the sink, left the fridge, cracked, and tousled my hair just enough to look unkempt. His car pulled in just before 11. He came up the walk humming something I didn't recognize and handed me another packet from one of the care centers. I held it in both hands and let them shake slightly. He asked if he could come in and I said, of course. We sat on the porch swing and he pointed out features from the brochure: walking paths, music rooms, community events. He described them the way someone might describe a timeshare brochure: cheerful, measured, and meant to reassure. Then he mentioned the paperwork, said he had spoken to someone named Ashby, a legal advisor who could help make sure everything was filed in advance so there would be no confusion if anything happened. He said the phrase gently as if it were kindness, not preparation. I nodded slowly, kept my gaze on the street. He stepped inside to take a call and I stayed still. The porch mic caught every word, clear and steady. I heard Ashby's name again, expedited review mental. Competence phrases like that threaded through his conversation. When he came back out, he handed me tea. I thanked him and asked if we'd spoken about this already. Last time he said we had, and smiled, said he was glad I remembered. Then he asked again if I'd like to visit the center on Thursday. I said, I'd think about it. I let the tea cool in my hands and said it tasted like something Arthur used to make. He didn't reply. just nodded and told me he'd call tomorrow after he left. I retrieved the mic from beneath the porch ledge and uploaded the file later that night. My Leland came by. She brought her tablet and a fresh flash drive. We transferred the new recordings and reviewed the notes Grant had left in the care center packet. He'd circled one line, in particular transfer of medical proxy contingent on observed need. She handed me a folder with a notarized affidavit confirming my medical and legal capacity, signed by Dr. Elkins and 2 witnesses. We didn't speak much that evening, we just worked. She labeled folders, organized the backups, added security steps. She showed me how to tag files for sequence and store duplicates in multiple locations. She reminded me gently that what we were building was not a defense, it was a record. 3 days after Grant's visit, Llewellyn delivered the formal response in person to Ashby's office. She didn't email it. She walked it to the front desk of the building where the law firm kept an office above a dentist's practice. She left it with the receptionist and asked that it be handed directly to him. Inside, the envelope was the affidavit, the updated will, the revocation of Grant's authority, and a written statement declaring all prior authorizations null. It was signed in duplicate and time-stamped that night. Llewellyn called her voice steady but low. She said Ashby had phoned her directly after reading the file. He hadn't argued or pushed back. He simply said he was stepping away from the case, then added that Arthur had once helped him during a difficult time. No explanation beyond that, but enough to make something shift inside me. The next morning, a courier delivered a letter addressed to me from Ashby. It was short. He stated he would no longer be involved in any matters related to my estate. Enclosed was a full record of documents filed on my behalf over the past 6 months. The paper trail included drafts, emails, and proposals. Some of the language matched word for word. Things Grant had said to me at the kitchen table and on the porch. One section had templates for future affidavits from neighbors or friends, describing forgetfulness or memory lapses. He had been preparing a case in the background. I called Llewellyn, and we agreed on a next step. She would prepare a statement of intent ready to file if needed, not a threat, but a boundary. It would formally declare that any attempt to override my decisions would be documented as legal overreach and elder coercion. That evening, I took Ashby's letter and placed it beside Arthur's old note in the drawer of my nightstand. I didn't feel triumphant or angry, just still. The air in the house no longer felt thin. It stood quietly around me, as if waiting for something real. The next morning began the way most did. Quiet light moving across the kitchen floor. The sound of the furnace clicking on and off. I brewed a fresh pot of tea while the house settled around me. The paperwork from the day before sat in a neat stack on the dining room table. Every page in order, each file named, backed up, and labeled. It didn't feel like strategy. It felt like something closer to preservation. I sat by the window with my journal open and added a new line to the page. Nothing lengthy, just a date and a phrase. Small, quiet, proof that I still remembered how to build something one step at a time. By mid-morning, I had started a new folder labeled Insurance and Correspondence. I printed out emails, marked and filed Grant's previous voicemails, and scanned the originals into the cloud. The days moved like that, slow, measured, steady, the way they had when I first started working in collections. Each item had a place. Each task held purpose. I no longer needed the checklist Llewellyn had written for me. I moved through it by memory and instinct, one by one, in the back of the linen closet. I found a copy of the deed to the house tucked between an old utility bill and a forgotten holiday card. I scanned it, added a note about the last property tax payment, then cross-referenced it with a transaction Grant had handled last summer. It matched, but the confirmation mattered, not because I doubted the numbers, but because I was learning to check for myself again. Each evening, I reviewed the folder structure, updated the master list, and backed up the files to the second encrypted drive. The process wasn't complicated. It was routine, the kind of routine that anchored you to something larger than the moment the air turned colder by the end of the week. And I spent one morning clearing out the basement closet. It was there that I found the last envelope from Arthur unopened, still sealed with his initials on the back. No note, no date, just my name written across the front in his even handwriting. I didn't open it right away. I placed it in the desk drawer next to the updated affidavit. The will and the signed letters. I would open it when I needed to. Later that afternoon, I received a call from Malilin. She asked if I'd be home Saturday. Said she wanted to bring something. Her voice was calm, but held a trace of something unspoken. I said yes, and marked it on the kitchen calendar. Saturday arrived with clear skies and a sharp wind. Just past noon, I heard the sound of a car door closing and looked out to see a young woman walking up the path. A canvas duffel on one shoulder, a laptop bag on the other. She knocked lightly and smiled when I opened the door. "This is Tessa," Malilin said as she stepped in behind her. "Her daughter. She's in grad school studying archival science." I offered them both tea while we moved into the kitchen, the kettle already warm. Tessa had an easy way about her. She didn't fill the room, but she didn't shrink from it either. She asked thoughtful questions about the scanner I was using and the labeling system I'd set up. And when I mentioned that the guest room still had extra blankets, she said that would work just fine by early evening. She had unpacked, stacked her books along the nightstand, and set up her hard drive in the corner of the room. I passed her a folder with clean copies of the legal documents, not the originals, and asked if she'd be comfortable storing a duplicate backup. She nodded and showed me the encrypted cloud directory she had already created that night. I heard her typing from the other room, not rushed or frantic, just a steady rhythm, the kind that reminded me of Arthur's old typewriter, the one he kept long after he stopped using it. The sound wasn't loud, but it filled the house in a way that felt familiar. The next morning, she offered to digitize some of my old notebooks, the ones I'd filled during my years at the library. She didn't ask for praise or permission, just carried them one by one to the table and began scanning each page, gently flattening the spine with a small cloth. I watched her for a while, then started sorting the remaining paper stacks into 3 piles. Grant called that night. His name lit up the screen, but I let it ring. No message. Just the missed call, blinking twice before disappearing. I didn't call back. Instead, I moved into the living room where Tessa was labeling storage boxes for the garage. She looked up and asked if I wanted to help in the morning. I said yes. It felt like saying yes to more than just cardboard and tape. It felt like saying yes to the shape of a life being put back together carefully, quietly. With both hands, the rooms no longer echoed the way they had. A week before, that night, I wrote a single sentence in my journal. The house is no longer quiet, and neither am I. Tessa and I spent the next morning in the garage, surrounded by open boxes and dusted bins. The air smelled faintly of cardboard and old cedar, the kind of scent that clings to holiday wreaths and forgotten camping gear. She handed me a roll of masking tape and a permanent marker, and we began sorting one box at a time. Books went into one pile, photographs into another, tax records into a third. She didn't talk much, just moved with quiet focus, checking for mold, separating duplicates, and handing me things when they needed a second look. When we found a carton labeled Arthur's Notebooks, she paused and asked if I wanted to scan them all. I nodded. She wiped the covers gently and placed the stack beside her laptop. The rhythm was slow, but not tedious. She handled every item the way someone handles something they don't want to break, with both care and respect. That afternoon, I made soup, and she stayed for dinner. We ate at the kitchen table under the soft light above the stove and talked about her final semester and the software she was learning. She asked if I wanted to learn how to back up the drive myself. I said yes. She walked me through the steps slowly twice, then had me do it on my own. I labeled the newest folder with that day's date. When she left for class the next morning, she printed out a list of backup times and slid it into the drawer beside the refrigerator. In case you forget, she said before heading out the door. Her teacup still sat near the sink, the steam gone, but the warmth lingering around noon. I heard the gravel shift in the driveway. Grant's car came to a stop just outside the window. I watched him sit there a while before stepping out. He walked up with the same folder I'd seen the last time, his pace slow but direct. The moment he knocked, I opened the door and stepped aside. Without a word, he greeted me like nothing had changed and followed me into the kitchen. I had warmed cider on the stove earlier. The scent of cinnamon still drifted through the air. I offered him a cup, and he accepted. Without sitting, he placed the folder on the table and stood beside it. Said he'd noticed Ashby had stepped away from the case and that things felt unclear now. Said it was important we stay on the same page. I didn't answer right away, just set his cup down and pulled open the side drawer. I took out a small stack of documents and placed them gently on the table. The new power of attorney, the revised will, the affidavit from Dr. Elkins, each one signed and dated. I slid them toward him one by one. He didn't touch them, just looked at them, then looked at me. I kept my voice, even told him I had made decisions for myself, responsible ones, and that I knew exactly what I was doing. His jaw shifted slightly. He didn't speak at first, just scanned the papers again. His eyes moved to the hallway, then back to the table. I didn't offer explanations. I didn't fill the silence. I simply said, "Not all silence is weakness." He stood there a moment longer, then gathered the papers into a neat stack and set them back on the table. He didn't fold them, didn't take them with him. He walked to the door slowly, didn't slam it, didn't say goodbye, just left the way he came. I stayed at the table for a while, let the air settle again, the soft clink of the clock on the mantel, the faint hum of the refrigerator. I reached under the napkin holder and stopped the recorder. Its red light blinking twice before going dark. The file already had a name in my head. Quiet confrontation, full clarity. That night, I didn't dream of courtrooms or folders or long phone calls. I dreamt of a room with open windows and clean ledgers, each box labeled, nothing left unsorted. And when I woke up, I remembered the envelope I had placed in the drawer weeks earlier, the one Arthur had addressed with my name and nothing else. I opened it slowly. The paper still crisp inside was a short letter written in his careful script. The lines, even the tone, calm he had written it a year before. His health started to fail. It said only what he needed to say, that I had always been stronger than I realized, that if the time ever came when someone questioned that strength, I should let the record show who I truly was. I read it once, then folded it again and placed it back beside the will and affidavit, tucked away with the documents that now spoke in my stead. When the phone rang an hour later, I didn't rush to answer it. I let it go to voicemail. Instead, the day after Grant's quiet visit passed without a call. The next morning, I walked through the house early while the light was still thin. I adjusted the blinds, watered the plants near the back window, and checked the battery on the porch microphone. Tessa left for class with her bag over one shoulder and a thermos in her hand. She reminded me to take a break from sorting and said she'd be back by dinner. I settled into the living room with my laptop and opened the digital archive. The folders were all there, clean and orderly, labeled with dates and cross-referenced in the logbook beside me. I reviewed the audio files again, listening not for emotion, but for detail. Grant's phrases hadn't changed much. He repeated the same suggestions, the same offers each time, with more structure, more intent in the folder. Labeled Ashby Response, I had stored the documentation Malaylan had delivered weeks ago, every copy time-stamped and countersigned. One file caught my eye. A scanned draft of a document Ashby had prepared before withdrawing it included proposed affidavits with blank sections for neighbor observations and daily confusion reports. The language was generic, but the intent wasn't. It was a framework ready to be filled. I printed a copy and added it to the main binder, then sat at the table and made a list at the top. I wrote follow-up. Then underneath one by one, I listed next steps. Call the bank, review utilities, cross-check, signature, authorizations at the bottom. I added a final line. Submit protective notice if provoked by afternoon. I had cleared a drawer in the hall closet to store the physical binders. The temperature had dropped outside, and the trees cast long shadows across the floor. The kind of quiet that made you pause. Not from fear, just awareness, around 4 o'clock. The doorbell rang. I knew before I looked it would be him. Grant stood there with both hands in his coat pockets. No folder this time, just a calm expression and a polite smile. I opened the door, stepped aside, and let him in. He asked how I'd been and glanced toward the kitchen where the light above the stove flickered once, then steadied. I offered him coffee. He declined. I walked past him and sat at the table. He didn't sit. He stood near the counter and started talking again about safety routines aging in place. But with support, he mentioned a center I hadn't heard before, said he'd spoken to someone on staff there who could arrange a private room. No waiting list. I listened without responding. Let him talk through the features and amenities, the social calendar, the shuttle service. Then he shifted tone, said he understood the paperwork had changed, but wanted to clarify his role. Said he'd never meant to step over me, only to protect what mattered most. I asked what that meant exactly. He paused. Didn't answer directly. Instead said the old documents had been confusing, that he had only stepped in to avoid complications. I reached for the binder on the table and opened it slowly. I turned to the tab labeled Legal Timeline and slid it across to him. The pages showed the sequence starting with Arthur's will, then the revoked authority, the medical affidavit, and Ashby's formal withdrawal. Grant's eyes didn't leave the page. He stood still, one hand resting on the back of the chair. I said nothing for a long moment, then closed the binder and folded my hands. He finally sat down, leaned forward slightly, and asked if I'd be willing to reconsider a shared oversight agreement. Said it would give both of us peace of mind in case something happened to me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't shift in my chair. I told him I had everything in writing, and that if anything did happen, it was all accounted for. The porch microphone caught every word again, the same way it had the last time. The recorder beneath the table ran silently through the entire conversation. By the time he stood to leave, the sun had dipped low and the living room had turned gold and gray. He reached for his coat, but didn't make eye contact before walking out. He didn't say when he'd be back. I stood at the window and watched him pause in the driveway, phone in hand, typing something quickly before driving off. I returned to the table, stopped the recorder, and labeled the file. Grant visit oversight pitch, then saved it to both drives. The next morning, I took the envelope from the drawer, the one Ashby had sent with the archive of all legal filings. I reviewed it again slowly this time, underlining the timestamps beside each draft document. 2 versions of the guardianship proposal listed language lifted directly from Grant's conversations with me. Word for word, the dates matched our recorded visits. I called Molelan just after 10. She answered on the second ring. I told her what I'd found, and she asked me to email the files over within the hour. She had drafted a statement titled Formal Notice of Capacity Breach. Any additional pressure or misrepresentation from Grant would now be met with immediate legal response. It was quiet insurance, just enough to shift the balance by the end of the week. The house had taken on a different rhythm. Tessa and I worked side by side in the evenings, updating the cloud directories, checking for redundancies, and storing the last of the physical copies in sealed document bags. She moved through the house easily now, humming while she waited for the microwave or leaving her textbooks open near the sink. She didn't need instructions anymore. On Sunday morning, she printed labels for the final archive set. I placed them in the fireproof safe, along with the letter from Arthur and the deed. The file was complete, not just proof, but presence. I wasn't holding on, out of fear. I was holding ground. It was just after 10 when the tires crunched across the gravel, again. I stood by the window, the curtain drawn only an inch. Grant's car rolled to a stop slower than usual, but with purpose. He stepped out with a folder tucked neatly beneath his arm. His coat collar turned up against the wind. His shoulders held straight but tight, the way they used to be when he was preparing for a difficult client call. I opened the door before he could knock. He offered a quiet hello and stepped inside without asking. I led him to the kitchen where the scent of warm cider lingered. I had lit a candle on the counter, one of the ones Arthur used to like in the colder months. Grant didn't sit right away. He placed the folder on the table, but kept his hands in his pockets. He asked how I'd been, then said he hoped we could speak plainly, that he hadn't intended to cause confusion, but was worried about the changes he had seen lately. I didn't interrupt. I let him speak. The words came carefully, each one chosen like he was walking across stones in shallow water. He mentioned Ashby's withdrawal again, said it had caught him off guard and made things unclear from a procedural standpoint. I walked to the cabinet, pulled down 2 mugs, and poured cider into both, then sat across from him quietly. He said he was concerned about documents being filed without proper family input. Said it didn't feel collaborative. I reached into the drawer beside me and brought out a stack of papers, not thick, just enough to be deliberate. I slid them across the table, one by one, the new power of attorney, the signed affidavit, the updated will, each page clean, dated, notarized. I didn't raise my voice or offer commentary. I simply said, the decisions had been mine and mine alone. His hand hovered over the top page, but didn't touch it. He looked at the documents, then at me, asked if I was certain this was what I wanted, that it wasn't being influenced by anyone. I told him plainly I had legal guidance, professional counsel, and full capacity. The conversation was being documented. He didn't flinch at that, only nodded once, then leaned back slightly in the chair. I let the silence stretch between us until he broke it again. Said he wished we had come to this point sooner. Said it wasn't easy for him either. That watching someone age came with difficult choices. I looked at him steadily and told him, I understood. Aging wasn't the issue, assumption was. I didn't elaborate. He didn't press when he stood to leave. He gathered the papers, gently placed them back on the table instead of taking them with him. He said he'd think things over and that he'd call in a few days. He didn't linger after that, just walked to the door and stepped out into the late afternoon light. I closed the door behind him, locked it, and walked straight to the table. The recorder under the napkin holder had caught every word. I stopped the recording and gave it a name I wouldn't forget. Full review in person. I uploaded the file to both drives, then placed a printed copy in the binder labeled Final Interaction. That evening, I made tea and sat in the den with the fireplace flickering low. Tessa was upstairs working through a cataloging assignment, but she came down later and asked if I needed anything. I handed her the new folder and asked her to add it to the archive. She didn't ask what it was, just nodded and carried it to the scanner with the ease of someone who understood the value of quiet precision. The next morning, I walked through the house slowly. The walls felt different, not because anything had changed, but because everything had. I opened a window in the front room, just a crack enough to let in fresh air. The kind that reminded you the seasons were still turning, whether you noticed or not. After lunch, I received a call from a blocked number. I let it go to voicemail. A few minutes later, a notification arrived, an audio file attached. The voice was Ashby's short direct. He confirmed the closure of all previous accounts related to my estate, stated no further legal action would proceed on his end, and ended with a sentence I hadn't expected. Your husband once extended me a kindness that mattered more than he knew. I listened to it twice, then saved the message to a private folder, backed it up labeled It Courtesy Closure, then sat at the kitchen table and opened my journal. I didn't write much, Just a few lines about clarity and stillness, and how it felt to be able to make space for something new as the sun lowered across the back of the house. I opened the small safe and placed the journal inside along with the updated files and Arthur's letter, then closed it and turned the key. The porch light came on automatically, its glow casting soft shadows across the front walk. I stood there for a long moment, watching the leaves stir at the base of the steps, then turned back toward the hallway. The house was quiet, but no longer waiting. It was ready. The house felt lighter in the days that followed, not empty or hollow, just settled, as if every room had let go of a long, slow breath. I moved from kitchen to living room with a kind of peace that didn't need to be spoken. The photos I'd boxed away during those tense weeks found their place again on the shelves. Family faces, memories framed in soft afternoon light. Tessa finished her last archiving session. One evening, the whir of her scanner, now as familiar as the hum of the furnace. She stacked the final folder labeled the drive and handed it to me with a smile. There was no ceremony, just a sense of work done. Well, she left for campus the next morning, her shoes clicking quietly down the front steps. She waved from the driveway, promising to visit over the holidays. I stood in the doorway a moment longer than usual, grateful for the hush she left behind in the stillness. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and sat at the table with my journal. The house was no longer a battleground for proof or defense, but a place where every drawer, every folder, had its own story neatly told. I thought of Arthur's last letter and the strength it had carried all the way through, even when my own voice felt too quiet to matter. His trust written in careful lines was the first light I found when I needed it most. The phone didn't ring much that week. Grant sent one text to say he'd be traveling for work, that he hoped I was well. I replied simply that I was, and left it at that. There was no anger left in me, only a sense that the boundary between us had finally become clear. It was not the ending I'd imagined, but it was the one I could live with. Tessa's teacup still sat by the sink, the faint trace of lemon verbena lingering in the air as the sun set. I walked through each room and touched the walls, letting my hands remember the work I'd done, the ground I'd reclaimed, when I sat down to write. That night, I found myself returning to the lesson at the heart of all those weeks. Not every fight is loud. Some victories live in silence in the steady, quiet work of protecting what matters, even when others try to rewrite your story. Dignity doesn't need permission. Strength isn't always force, and kindness, even toward yourself, is a form of courage. If you've listened all the way to the end, thank you for sharing this time with me. I hope my story reminds you that your voice matters and that even quiet strength can change everything. Take care of yourself, and if you'd like, share your own story or thoughts in the comments. I'd be honored to hear them.